So last week we ended our deep dive into the daily activities of Jesus, as we just discussed, through Passion Week, and we left off on Resurrection Sunday, Easter, and Jesus had appeared at the end of our day last week. Jesus had appeared to 10 of his disciples who had gathered behind the locked doors in the upper room, and only one disciple was missing. Remember? Thomas was missing. So although Passion Week is over and this isn't like a day in the life, I just couldn't end with the missing disciple, right? It just led me to consider deep diving into Jesus's appearance now. What appearances did he make between Easter Sunday and his ascension to heaven, which will be 40 days later? So today we're going to kick off a little bit of when Jesus appears. And we are going to talk about him presenting his newly resurrected self to Thomas, the missing in action disciple. Now, anyone familiar with the disciples of Jesus know that Thomas is referred to as Doubting Thomas, right? Poor guy. John, in his book, explains why in chapter 20, after the other 10 had seen Jesus, John writes this, verse 24, now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. But Thomas responds to them saying, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Okay, so Thomas wanted proof, right? But honestly, to label Thomas a doubter seems to be very unfair assessment of his character. Because after all, this is the only occasion that we read of Thomas being skeptical. So we don't have much regarding speaking encounters of Thomas, but when you combine all that we do have, we gain an interesting insight into the journey of faith that mirrors our own. Remember, we've talked about Thomas being the twin. A couple of reasons was they thought he looked like Jesus, and or because as a twin, he mirrors a lot of our own life, right? So with that in mind, before deep diving into the specific encounter when Jesus shows up as his resurrected self to Thomas, allow me to give you a bigger picture of Thomas's journey and how his story is a true reflection of the phases of a growing faith in Jesus. Okay, so phase one, growing confidence. Anytime you are going to put faith in something, you need a growing confidence in it, right? So Jesus invited Thomas to follow him as a disciple after his first miracle, turning the water into wine. So close proximity to Jesus allowed his questions of who Jesus was to turn into this confident belief and truth. He has a front row seat to miracles and signs. He was a devout student of Jesus's teachings for 3.5 years. And as the ministry of Jesus grew around Thomas, and as he's witnessing it, so did his confident belief in Jesus being Son of God. So his confidence is being built, and we see his confident faith in Jesus dramatically displayed 2 different occasions during Jesus's earthly ministry. The first one is in John 11. We have taught about this, but it was reported to Jesus that Jesus's friend Lazarus was dead. Jesus announces to his disciples, hey, we're now going to go to Judea. And the disciples are adamantly reminding him, no, are you serious? You can't go there. The Jews tried to stone you the last time and kill you the last time we were there. You really want to go back? You could die. Jesus reiterates the importance of this trip, stressing to his disciples at that point that the faith of your faith, the faith of his disciples and their ability to grow in true belief, is a paraphrase of what Jesus said to them, is dependent on going back into enemy territory. Okay, so Thomas Despite the warnings of the other disciples, he hears this and he leaps up and he says, then let us all go that we may die with him. This wasn't a sarcastic statement, right? Well, fine, let's all go, we'll all die. It was a genuine display of his loyalty, a courageous willingness to lay down his life for Jesus right here, right now. And as promised, the confidence Thomas needed to deepen his faith was provided by Jesus when he witnessed Lazarus being raised from the dead, from the grave. Okay, so Thomas at this point sees this, witnesses this, and he realized not only does Jesus have power to heal the living and teach these amazing things, he's in control of death. Okay, another deepening, confident encounter. So just like Thomas, though, all along the way of our faith, we are building our confidence in the writings and teachings of Jesus. And we are growing in faith as we encounter his promises being fulfilled in our life. That's a mirror of what we do and journey in our faith as well, right? So the second time we see Thomas's personal faith expressed is in John 14, after the Last Supper. Jesus had just revealed, remember we talked about this, his imminent departure, his upcoming departure, and he tells the disciples, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Jesus then continues to tell him, I'm going to go prepare a place for you. And when everything is ready, I'll come and get you, so you will always be with me where I am. And you will know the way to where I am going. Thomas, refusing to pretend to understand this mysterious revelation that Jesus was talking about, is the only disciple willing to express the elephant in the room. He's like, excuse me, we have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way? Notice that Jesus didn't reprimand him for asking what everybody else was probably thinking, but didn't have the courage to ask. It was an expression of love, in all honesty, because he was saying, wait, I don't know the way, and I want to come, so please tell me how to get there. Charles Spurgeon points out that Thomas wasn't timid in the presence of Jesus. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, expressing what he didn't know at this moment actually opened the door for Jesus to reveal what everyone would need to know. Because what was his response? Jesus told Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except for me. So he didn't know what all that meant at that time, but soon enough, he would. So 3.5 years of intimate encounters with Jesus builds this courageous and loyal faith in Thomas, in the fact that Jesus is who he has said he is, who he claims to be. So Thomas is all in, or so he thought. Because as life tends to do, events and circumstances arise that lead to another phase of faith. Phase 2, turbulence shakes the confidence. So it's believed that along with building a faith in Jesus as Messiah, somewhere underneath, Thomas was also building on the false belief that many Jews also had at that time, that Jesus was a political savior, about to overthrow Rome and rescue them from their oppression, right? When Thomas expressed a willingness to die with Jesus by going to Judea, it's believed that he thought the bold return of Jesus to Judea at that time, in the midst of his enemies, was less about Lazarus and more about a battle cry. A time to face the enemy by gathering the troops, right? Since Jesus had made numerous references to his coming death, there was an unspoken false belief that Jesus would die a battle hero in Rome. So Thomas, probably just like Judas and several of the others, were looking for this moment to happen. So confidence and faith in Jesus, but also confident in a false plan and reality, were being built at the same time. And the question of Thomas to know where Jesus was going, scholars say, was based on the false belief that Jesus was going to go fight the enemies and he would need backup. So we need to know how to get there. So he thought this earthly battle was about to begin. And he's like, I need to know where you're going so we can join you in this holy war that we're about to embark on. But what he didn't understand is that Jesus was going to the Father by way of the cross. So we don't know where Thomas was during the crucifixion, but he obviously did not escape the details of that Friday execution. And he definitely realized at that point, this wasn't a war with Rome. This was a war to the death. So I'm a terrible flyer. I hate flying, right? When you're flying and turbulence hits, doesn't that make you question the reality and the reliability of that plane or the pilot, right? Because turbulence exposes the weak and vulnerable pieces of that piece of equipment, right? Likewise, turbulence of life can take a confident and loyal faith and turn it upside down. The loss of a loved one in our own personal circumstances, loss of a job, loss of relationship, any and other all unexpected and unplanned disruptions in our life can violently shake our confidence in what we thought we knew and what we thought we believed. That is where Thomas finds himself on Resurrection Sunday. His reality, his plans, his dreams are all shaken and stirred and sifted, revealing a traumatized faith. He's like, Jesus didn't fight. Jesus didn't even flee. Jesus just fell to the enemy and now he's gone. And that's where we pick up on our passage today. So let me reread again, John 20:24. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. Now, all the other 10 disciples are coming after him. They're like going into all the details. And according to Greek, when it says they are telling him, we've seen the Lord, this is an over and over repetitive thing. Over and over again, they're saying, we've seen Jesus alive. No, you have to believe us. We've seen him alive. And John even makes reference when he says one of the 12 was not with them. He's basically saying, Thomas got tired of hearing it. Thomas couldn't even take the unanimous testimony of all those closest to him, so it fell on deaf ears. And when John says, even one of the 12, we're going to find out, doesn't believe, can you believe that one of the 12 closest to Jesus struggled to believe? So in an emotional response to all of them coming at him, he's still trying to process his emotions, trying to figure out what's what with life. Thomas finally seems to break and says, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails and put my finger into the print of the nails and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Insight number 1 on your outline. Turbulence has a way of exposing the cracks and deficits in our faith, or even where our faith has become misplaced in someone or something other than Jesus. That's what's happening to Thomas. And that's when we encounter phase 3. Doubt sets in. Unless I see it, unless I touch it, I won't believe it. After Thomas says this, it appears that he just leaves. He walks out. So Thomas may have been the first one to expose his personal doubt, but he's not the first one who doubted. Do we look at the fact that Mary doubted a resurrected Jesus by asking for the body of Jesus over and over again? Peter and John doubted by refusing to believe Mary. And they even struggled to believe the second time. Rather than a doubter, Thomas could be characterized as an honest and authentic follower and seeker of Jesus, who at this point is willing to go to the darkest parts of his thoughts and the deepest part of his grief and speak these truthful yet vulnerable words. His unbelief was strong, but it was honestly spoken. In his humanity, could he have been so shocked by the tragedy of the cross that his heart just couldn't handle the amount of faith that it needed to believe the death of Jesus could be undone at this point? Thomas refused to pretend. Now, there are times when we may need to lean on the faith of others as we seek to build or restore our own faith. And the disciples are trying to keep Thomas there, but Thomas walks away. Thomas leaves the support that he had, the other people that were telling him truth. Because in verse 26, it begins by saying, and after 8 days. So there's 8 days between, unless I see, and what we now know. Thomas has isolated himself. Phase number 4, what do we do when turbulence hits so often? Distance is made. Thomas was so shattered and shaken that he distanced himself from the other disciples. Again, we don't have a record of Thomas at the cross or at the tomb, and he wasn't with all the other disciples at the end of Easter Sunday, so he missed out on seeing Jesus. But for 8 days, it appears he isolated himself. What was he doing? He was entrenched in his doubt, letting it simmer day by day by day. But why did Thomas make this choice to put distance between himself and other believers? Well, we don't know for certain, but remember, if we're twins and we're mirroring, if Thomas is a mirror to our own personality and our own process, and for any of us who have been in that space where turbulence has rattled us and we've put distance, we can infer some reasons. We can definitely make some conversations around why people cut others out at the deepest, darkest moments of their life. Did he not want anyone to see his grief? Anybody been there? Was he jealous that he missed out and that added to his grief and isolation? I can relate to that envy. Fine, forget it. You guys got it, I didn't, I'm just done. Did this once battle-ready disciple now feel ashamed of his weakness? Because the turbulence makes us weak, exposes it, right? Was he avoiding the truth of others because anger felt better? I mean, I could go on and on. These are all human reactions. But grief has a way of wanting to be alone, hidden. But when we distance ourselves from others in times of doubt and frustration, we miss the opportunity designed by God that comes from community. After all, he was the only one. He wasn't the only one that was encountering confusion and stress and devastation, but he was the only one that isolated himself. Thomas missed, because of that corporate joy of encountering a resurrected Jesus with other bodies of believers. By distancing himself, he only succeeded at keeping himself stuck in a place of desperation and sorrow for longer. One scholar said this: Thomas did the very worst thing that a melancholy man can do, went away to brood in a corner by himself, and so to exaggerate all his idiosyncrasies, to distort the proportion of the truth, and hug his despair by separating himself from his fellows. Therefore, he lost what they got, the sight of the Lord. Faith is best built in community, where we are surrounded in times of crisis and doubt with those who have a confidence and a trust to share when ours is getting depleted. I've had my own fair share of faith-shaking moments in my life, and for the longest time, my initial response to these difficult events causing questions or doubts or sorrow was to separate from everyone. I would hide under a rock until I felt strong enough to present myself with confidence again. My struggle with infertility probably drove the deepest season of doubt and isolation in my life. And I honestly can say at that point, I'm not sure I had a thread of faith left. I didn't go to church. I distanced myself from people. I distanced myself from God. I didn't stop believing in God. I was just angry with God. I refused to hang out with anyone until finally one person showed up at my house. And after failed attempts to get her to leave, politely trying to get her to leave, I finally told her, I just don't have faith to walk through this anymore. And all she said to me was, then I will have faith for you. Because sometimes we don't have it, but somebody else can give it to us. And which is why we need to be in community and not isolated in those times. And before you think, oh, I don't struggle with unbelief or doubt, let me dive a little deeper. Dare I say that doubt shows up in other ways other than unbelief? Worry? Isn't that a doubt that God will take care of your needs? Fear? Isn't that a doubt that God is not big enough to protect? Stress? Isn't that doubt that God is not powerful enough to overcome? We control? That's a form of doubt that God won't do what he promised. So before you think, oh, I don't have doubt or unbelief, it's the times of turbulence that help expose those things. If you're feeling fear because of the circumstances, worry, what are you not believing? There's a part of Jesus that you're not receiving, that you're not trusting. That and many more are all manifestations of doubt and often lead us into isolation and deplete our faith. So for 8 days, Thomas's faith was becoming more and more depleted. And I don't know if Peter or James or John kept going after him, kept trying to knock on his door, kept trying to get him to come back. But given what we know of them, I bet they did. These men were tight. They weren't going to let Thomas go that easy. And after all, Jesus had taught them to leave the 99 and go after the one that was strayed. We don't know. But if I know Jesus and I know what they had been taught, I don't think they would have just let Thomas be. Because, as we know, after 8 days, verse 26, and after 8 days, his disciples were again inside and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. So once again, Thomas is here. Jesus materializes in this upper room behind locked doors where the disciples are still hiding. And he greets them in the same way. It's almost like there's a special do-over for Thomas. He didn't have to do those exact same things, but he gave Thomas a little bit of a do-over. And after popping in, Jesus immediately turns and he locks eyes with Thomas. Then he said to Thomas, verse 27, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it in my side. Now notice that Jesus immediately met Thomas right where Thomas honestly confessed himself to be. Jesus can't meet us if we are aware of where we need him. Even in his doubt, Jesus is offering Thomas this gift of faith and inviting him to encounter the proof that he desired. Jesus wasn't obligated, but he also wasn't offended by it. He extended what all of us need at times, and that's phase 5, evidence for restoring faith. Within just moments of seeing Jesus, Thomas got way more evidence than he encountered in the 3.5 years of walking beside Jesus. So let me just explain really quickly what evidence did Thomas get from Jesus at this moment, in an instant, by the way. Number 1, evidence that Jesus is omniscient, meaning he is all-knowing. How did he know that? Well, because Jesus wasn't physically present when Thomas made this statement demanding his belief about being seeing and touching based on his terms. Yet Jesus knew it. And if he knew that, well, then now Thomas had evidence that Jesus is omnipresent, meaning he was everywhere at once. Because in order for Jesus to know that what Thomas said without physically being there, Thomas realized Jesus was still actually some way there supernaturally. And seeing Jesus also proved to Thomas that, number 3, Jesus is omnipotent, meaning he is all powerful, because not only did he just miraculously appear in a locked room without opening a door or window, but he was dead and now he's not. And that takes some serious, unlimited, supernatural ability to beat death. But what I love is before Thomas even has a chance to respond, before Thomas even, as we are told, touches Jesus, Jesus challenges him by continuing and saying, do not be unbelieving, but believing. Simply put, according to original Greek, this phrase, Jesus is saying, stop becoming faithless. Which is interesting. He wasn't fully faithless, but he was becoming faithless. In other words, the trajectory that you are on by having isolated yourself in your doubt may not have obliterated your faith, but it is decreasing it with every moment. And one scholar wrote, sincere faith doesn't prohibit sincere investigation. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. And doubt isn't a replacement for faith, but rather it can become an opportunity to either grow deeper in it or diminish it. All of that happened because Thomas was willing to expose it, and Jesus showed up to Thomas when Thomas stopped distancing himself and returned. Jesus always responds to the one who wants to move from doubt and unbelief or worry or fear or stress to faith. And all of that leads to a more profound relationship with him, a more understanding of who he is. And that leads to phase 6, transformation of our heart and life. Like I mentioned, it's interesting that John doesn't tell us that Thomas actually touched the wounds of Jesus. It seemed that the mere sight of Jesus was enough. The very thing that Thomas thought he needed for his faith wasn't at all necessary to diminish his doubt and restore his faith. He only needed to truly see the resurrected Jesus. That's all it took, which makes me think that insight number 2, sometimes we want to be overwhelmed with answers or solutions as evidence needed to build and restore faith, when all we truly need is to be overwhelmed by sitting in the presence of Jesus. We're told that Thomas was so overwhelmed by the presence of the resurrected Jesus that he, verse 28, answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Immediately, Thomas's heart transitions from unbelief to what we will come to learn to be a radical and unshakable faith. But it's interesting. He doesn't call Jesus teacher. Mary did at the tomb. She refers to him as teacher. He didn't call him rabbi or master or friend. Thomas says, my Lord and my God. Thomas makes it so personal. You're not just God, you are my God at this moment. At this moment, Thomas verbally expressed a personal faith in Jesus as God that no other disciple had done up until this point. His doubt led him to much more than he had asked for, a heart that becomes so entrenched in the presence of Jesus that all he could do was fully surrender. Jesus said to him, verse 29, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Another reason scholars believe that Thomas never touched him, because Jesus didn't say, see and touch. But because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So what we're left here is with a blessing for those who will only hear of the death and resurrection of Jesus, yet still choose to believe. However, I love how Charles Spurgeon suggests that even we can diminish this promised blessing of blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe by doing some of the same things that Thomas did. He names several things that can diminish that blessing. When we demand for a voice, a vision, a revelation to prove our faith. When we demand for special circumstances to prove our faith. When we demand for some ecstatic experience. When we demand for an answer to every difficult question or objection. When we demand what men think of us as success in our work for Jesus. When we demand that others support us in our faith and belief. So Jesus says we are blessed when we believe without a need for more than what he has already provided, his truth. And Thomas gets it at this point. And Thomas thought he was all in. Now Thomas is all in, because from this point on, Thomas goes on to be a force to be reckoned with. A faith that was now on fire, an unravelable faith, which leads to the final phase, is phase 7, a permanent faith. Thomas lives the rest of his life with an unshakable faith, not absent of sorrow or turbulence or weariness, but absence of disbelief or need for proof. Following the ascension of Jesus, we learn from outside sources that Thomas traveled to India as a missionary, bringing the gospel to a whole new people, converting hundreds of Hindu families, probably thousands of Hindu families, to a faith in Jesus. He was a faithful and devoted follower all the way until he was executed, when he was taken out of the city and that he was preaching in, and he was speared to death. One scholar said this about his demise, followed by an unshakable faith. He said, a faith that is not tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. That's pretty powerful. Thomas was a loyal, honest man. His doubts weren't a way of life, but a means to seek the truth. Jesus lovingly met Thomas at the exact point of his need and guided him back to faith because he openly expressed it. We all know faith is a journey. And these phases Thomas displayed through his life are identical for us to expose the deficits and misplaced beliefs that we may be holding on to, or plans that we've demised that, oh, I'm praying Jesus does this, and then I'm going to really trust him. The goal is always permanent faith, but we can't beat ourselves up if turbulence causes questions or doubts or worries or fears. What we just need to do is find the truth needed to grow in confidence where it is lacking, expose where it is lacking, and build on the confidence Jesus has provided through Scripture to make a deeper commitment to belief. And for most of us, this will take our whole life on earth, quite honestly. And only heaven will bring that permanent and unwavering and unshakable faith. But with each encounter of evidence and truth comes a deeper realization for a heart transformation or a life transformation, and a deeper understanding that Jesus is our personal Lord, and to remember that we are never enough without him. And what evidence do we turn to? The last two verses, 30 and 31. And truly, Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Not when everything works out as you hoped, whenever God answers your specific prayers, but what Jesus has already done becomes enough for your faith. And it's my desire for Anchored House Church to be a place of truth-telling, so that we, as our mission statement says, build a community of believers who are anchored in and actively transformed by the Word of God. Not by what God does in and out, but by what he has already said. So my challenge and my encouragement is, let's not settle for less than a faith that is constantly growing, but be willing to disclose when we know we're not enough, when our faith is being shattered or shaken, becoming fully aware of what it is we're not trusting and we're not believing, so that in the end, we can literally look at God and say, my Lord, my God, you are enough, as Thomas did.